Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy-Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to be reading more of The Edge of Running Water from the Rim of Morning collection by William Sloane. Previously on, Mrs. Marcy died. Appears to have fallen down some stairs and been concussed, but then, according to Mrs. Walters, revived due to smelling salts, and she helped walk her part of the way back home. Oh, I forgot to do that. Helped her walk part of the way back home, according to Mrs. Walters, and then left her. However, it appears that she wandered off and fell into the river and drowned. Her body has been found, and now Dick, Anne, Julian, and Mrs. Walters all kind of have to face the music and be interviewed by the local law enforcement, the sheriff in this case, Mr. Hoskins, who has sent his sister on ahead to keep an eye on them, basically, and she will act as note taker for Sheriff Hoskins. Yes, I think that catches us up, more or less. Yep. Alrighty. Give me 1 sec here, and we'll get rockin' and a-rollin'. Chapter 17. The clump of feet on the back steps brought my attention to focus again. The clump of feet on the back steps brought my attention into focus again. I got heavily up from the sofa and went out to the door. As I stumbled through the dark hall, I tried to remind myself of the need for caution, discretion, a tight rein of restraint on everything I said or did from this moment on. The man outside was knocking before I got to the kitchen, and he made a peremptory noise of it. You could have told by nothing more than the way he knocked that he was the law. When he came into the lamplight, I saw that he was a big man, something like his sister in face, but heavier of nose and jaw. The humor that lay in the corners of her mouth was missing from his. The humor that lay in the corners of her mouth was missing from his. He looked strong, solid, and not quite grim. Thoroughly determined would be closer to it. After my first glance at him, I knew that nothing could be done to alter anything about this man's actions. He would do his duty as he saw it, and the chips could fall anywhere they chose. We introduced ourselves, and I took him into the living room. He didn't offer to shake hands, by the way.
"Hello, Ellen," he said. "Sorry I kept you waiting so long. Took longer at Marcy's than I expected."
He looked the room over once, without interest, and settled his gaze on Anne.
"You're Miss Connor, I calculate."
"Yes, I am." Anne's voice was low but steady and calm. She was clearly in complete control of herself, and I felt a rush of admiration for the way she sat there, her head high but not defiant, her eyes level. Dan Hoskins wasted no more time on the civilities.
"Well, it's kinda late, and I'll try to get this over with fast as I can."
He looked at us inquiringly.
"If you don't mind if Ellen, here, takes a few notes for me?"
"Not at all," I assured him.
"Good."
He smiled faintly.
She likes to help me out. Gives her something to do. Well, you two just tell her your addresses so we get that down all right and proper.
Ellen Hoskins had produced a notebook and several pencils, sharpened to needle points, as I observed. I suspected that detail was typical of her. She was the kind of woman who never needed to ask for anything. We gave her the facts about ourselves while the sheriff watched the two of us without expression. Then he cleared his throat.
This ain't anything really official, he observed, but I figure I better collect all the information I can as quick as possible. Folks in town is kinda wrought up about the whole thing, and it'll be best for all concerned if we get it clear right away.
Sit down, I suggested. If it's just informal, all of us will be glad to tell you what we know. Shall I call Mrs. Walters? He shook his head.
Not yet. By the way, whereat is she and Mr. Blair?
I told him about that, and then suggested that if he wanted information, I could tell him the story of the day as Anne and I knew it. Then, if he wanted to ask any questions, he could. Ellen Hoskins frowned when I advanced this proposal, but her brothers seemed to approve.
Might as well, he agreed. Maybe I ought to keep you two apart and see if you tell the same story, but God knows you've had a plenty time to go over it already. Shoot.
Stop me if I go too fast for you, Miss Hoskins, I said. She looked up from her notebook. You've got only one mouth, she remarked dryly. I expect I'll be able to keep up with it.
She's used to professors, her brother observed with satisfaction. You don't need to worry about her.
I launched into the account of the day's events, summarizing them briefly up to the moment of our return to the house, and the discovery of Mrs. Marcy lying at the foot of the stairs. When he heard that Anne and I were not actually in the house when the accident occurred, the big man frowned.
So neither of you saw it happen then?
No.
Do you know if anybody did?
Thinking back, I found that I was not wholly sure about that. I don't believe so, I said. Mrs. Walters did say something about Mrs. Marcy's having fallen, but I'm reasonably certain she used a word like must. She must have fallen, or something like that. He turned to his sister.
Make a note to ask about that, Ellen.
I've already got it. Her voice was wholly uninflected.
How did she look when you saw her lying there?
He sounded as if he assigned a good deal of importance to my answer, and I noticed that he was alert for all the relaxation in his posture. Not in any tense or overt way, but with the patient expectation of a fisherman staring at the cork float on his line. I don't know exactly. Sprawled out and limp, I should say. She was right at the foot of the stairs, as I said, and lying perfectly still. Her face was grayish, and her eyes were closed. At least, I think they were. Yes, said Anne in a low voice. The big man nodded.
Go ahead.
Then Mrs. Walters picked her up, almost right away, and carried her in here to the sofa. I did notice then that the poor woman's arm hung down rather peculiarly. Her hand was turned out from her body instead of in. Dan Hoskins grunted at that and turned to Anne.
You see that, too?
No, I didn't notice. He turned back to me and revolved one square, thick hand at the wrist.
Like that, huh? Like her wrist or her arm was busted?
He suggested. I nodded. But of course it couldn't have been. The tracks along the road later pretty well disproved that idea.
So? Well, anyhow, the reason I asked was that when we found her, it seemed like both her arms was busted.
He paused, but I could think of nothing to reply. After a time, he went on. Dubiety. I haven't seen the word dubiety. It's a sense of dubiousness. I'm probably mispronouncing it. He paused, but I could think of nothing to reply. After a time, he went on, dubiety in his tone.
Maybe not, of course. We'll know more about that when Doc Peters turns in his report. And then again, maybe it was the water did it.
She couldn't have carried that umbrella if she'd had two broken arms. He looked puzzled at that, so I went on to finish my story. The whole miserable business, including our stupid failure to call at the Marcy house to find out about her. He listened with attention and never once interrupted, but I felt that my story was clashing with something else that was already in his mind. There was a stubborn set to his mouth.
"Sounds like you're right about the broken bones," he admitted when I finished, "but when we found her, seemed to me like she was all brooken. Of course, that current sets in against the rock pretty hard when the tide's ebbing, but—"
I wondered what he was getting at. If Mrs. Marcy had any broken bones, it was clear enough that the current must have been responsible for them. Else, how could she have walked as far as she did? Mrs. Walters was no fool, either. She would never have let the woman out of the house if she had thought Mrs. Marcy was seriously hurt. Her remarks about Seth Marcy proved that to my own satisfaction. "But you saw those tracks in the mud, I suppose?" The question was put in as tactful a tone as I could muster, but I wanted to be sure that nothing which could exculpate us, wholly or in part, was omitted from those precise, rapid notes that Ellen Hoskins was taking. He studied the palm of one big hand for a moment before he answered.
"Yep, I saw them. I reckon there ain't much doubt about how it all happened."
Somehow his tone contradicted his words, though he sounded not so much skeptical as dissatisfied. After a while he gave us the clue as to what was in his mind.
"It seems kind of queer to me, her falling in that way, even if she had hurt her head. This farm here and the next one were about second nature to her. Must have been—"
He closed his hand and looked up.
"Well, you can't help me there. I'll have to talk it over with Doc Peters."
The way in which this man asked his questions and thought aloud interested me. Generally, instead of looking at us, he kept his eyes fixed on some corner of the room or the line of the baseboard. Once, long ago, I had had a Latin teacher who did the same thing in class. Never looked at you when he called for a recitation, but stared at an Alinari photograph of the Forum before Mussolini and said, "Mr. Sales, can you give us the future perfect of ale?" He'd been the shrewdest teacher in the school for all that, and Big Dan Hoskins made me remember him. In a moment he called on me to recite again.
"You and this young lady wasn't here, then, when Elora left the house?"
"No, she was gone when we got back to town."
"Uh-huh. And you didn't worry about her special?"
"No." I went on to tell him briefly about my conversation with Mrs. Walters and suggested that he ought to question her about that part of it. Much better. Emphasis on the right syllable.
"I'll get to her,"
he remarked calmly, and went on to make certain from me that the first indication we had... Yes, okay, I did read that correctly.
"I'll get to her,"
he remarked calmly, and went on to make certain from me that the first indication we had of anything wrong was Seth Marcy's arrival at the back door. When I finished, he sighed.
About what I expected, but thank you just the same, Professor. Now, just think back on the whole thing once more and see if there's anything you'd want to add to your statement."
That last word stuck in my mind. I didn't exactly like its implications. "Statement?" I said. "I don't see why I have to make a statement. There's no crime here."
"No," he admitted, and then paused. "Fact is, I'd like to make sure this thing ain't put in the wrong light around town, Professor."
He cleared his throat.
"Like I said, folks is some stirred up, naturally. Elora was well liked. It'll be hard for a lot of them to believe she'd make a mistake like walking off the Meadow Road into the river, even considering she'd had a crack on the head. For Seth's sake, and yours, you understand, it would be a pity if anyone was to think she," his voice stumbled, "jumped into it a purpose."
I stared at him. The very notion was fantastic, but I began to see what he meant, or thought I did. "Oh. But they couldn't blame anyone round here for that, even so. I'm positive she didn't commit suicide, but even if she did, it wasn't because of anything connected with us here."
"No?"
His voice was noncommittal.
I'm not saying it would be, especially Miss Connor and you, Professor. But if you'll excuse my way of putting it, Mr. Blair and that Mrs.
Walters.
Walters, they seem like kind of queer people to us here in Barsham. We ain't accustomed to foreigners.
There was a sudden half-smile at the corners of Ellen Hoskins' mouth at that last words.
They being queer, let's say, and it being queer that Ella Marcy would walk into the river off her own field, there's some will make a connection.
He looked directly at me, and from his manner I guessed that what he was going to say was going to be something he regarded as vitally important.
Just what is it that your Mr. Blair's working on here, Professor?
The question took me by surprise, and I knew the consternation it had caused my mind must be visible on my face. The control I had been able to keep in the course of the examination so far was instantly dissolved. It was impossible to foresee the results of any answer that I might make. I damned myself for not having prepared for this emergency. I should have had a good, workable half-truth, or even a plausible lie, ready to meet that inevitable inquiry. For if I answered it truthfully, Dan Hoskins and all Barsham Harbor would assume that Julian was mad, which I had to admit to myself he probably was, and immediately connect his insanity with Mrs. Marcy's death. Perhaps they would believe that Julian had driven her insane by the sheer madness of his project, or infected her with his own mental trouble, as if insanity were a contagious disease. Added to that, of course, they would be properly horrified and suspicious. The problem we had to face was how to convince Dan Hoskins, and, through him, the whole of Barsham Harbor, that there was no connection between the tragedy of the afternoon and anything which Julian was doing in that upstairs room of his. After all, that was no more than the simple truth, or so I assured myself. Yet the thrust of fear that had gone through me at the sheriff's question should have taught me better. There was a connection. There was a connection, more than one connection, between Mrs. Marcy and the invention of Julian Blair. Somewhere in my mind I was aware of that, but what the relationship between the two things was, I did not know. Meantime, Dan Hoskins was waiting for his answer. "Why, I don't know that I have the right to divulge anything about that," I began, sparring for time and an explanation of my hesitation in replying. "Julian's work is hard to describe to anybody who isn't an expert anyway. He's an electrophysicist, and he's an expert on electric waves and circuits. He made most of the improvements on the modern radio tube, for instance. Right now, he is studying some faint electrical phenomena that no one knows much about yet. Waves that are something like radio waves, if you want to put it that way." The sheriff sounded mildly amused.
"The talk is that he's building a machine to make a death ray."
The unconscious irony of that struck me so swiftly that I wanted to burst into laughter. I managed to throttle the impulse into a smile. "No, Sheriff, nothing like that." Then I added, "Mrs. Marcy did tell me she'd heard the same story, but she knew better, too."
"I see,"
he said absently. Following the line of his eyes, I saw that he was watching Anne. There was anxious apprehension on her face and in the way she was leaning forward to look at me. Her expression, every line in her body, revealed much more openly than anything I had said about how deeply concerned we were with Julian's invention. I'm going to reread that, I stumbled. There was anxious apprehension on her face and in the way she was leaning forward to look at me. Her expression, every line in her body, revealed much more openly than anything I had said how deeply concerned we were with Julian's invention. If I had hoped the sheriff could be decoyed from that scent, I knew that after one look at Anne it was a forlorn expectation. Well, I reflected, she was young and tired, and she couldn't realize how much she was giving away to a shrewd man like Dan Hoskins. Probably it was a secret we shouldn't be able to keep indefinitely under any circumstances. The sheriff watched Anne for a moment and then shifted his eyes to the baseboard. I had the uncomfortable certainty that he could observe all he wanted or needed out of their corners.
"I see,"
he said again, and went on, slowly and casually.
"Mr. Blair wasn't using a lorry in any way to help him with his work, was he?"
What? I was genuinely startled. Good God, no.
All right, he said soothingly. I'm looking as much for what didn't happen as for what did.
He scratched his head.
You're certain sure Elora wasn't mixed up in whatever it is the old man's making?
It gave me a shock to hear him call Julian an old man, but of course that was true of him, physically at least. Only, it had been such a short time ago that Julian was far from old. I called my mind back with a jerk to the question. I'm positive. All she ever did was to sweep out his workroom once a week.
Yesterday?
I think yesterday was her day for that. I'm not sure. But honestly, Sheriff, I can't see any connection. Mrs. Marcy tried to find out from me in the morning what Mr. Blair was working on. That was stretching the truth a good deal, but this was no occasion for moral scrupling. I didn't tell her much, so she finally informed me that she was certain Julian's work was on a radio of some sort. She poked fun at the people who talked about a death ray. He nodded his head several times, heavily, and was silent. At length he sighed.
You can't think of anything more you'd like to tell me? I'm out of questions. I'm clean out of questions.
Fatigue was numbing my brain until I was almost unsure whether I was awake or asleep. But I went laboriously back over the story I had told. Most of it was the truth, if not the whole truth, but it finally occurred to me that I had made it unnecessarily meager. Mrs. Marcy's fall was a natural accident, but I could at least suggest a cause for it and thereby make it somewhat more credible. Yes, I told the sheriff, there is one thing. It's possibly not important or even relevant, but if I'm going to sign any statement, I'd like to have it included. The point is just this. Coming back from the water toward the house, there was an exceptionally loud and alarming clap of thunder. Surprise was openly printed on Dan Hoskins' face.
Thunder?
He said, as if he had not heard me rightly. As if he had not heard me rightly. Yes, the noise was so sudden and loud it even frightened me in spite of myself. It must have been very near the house. Another of my slippery half-truths, I thought. It was in the house, or there's something the matter with my ears. I'm inclined to believe that it must have startled Mrs. Marcy while she was coming downstairs. She slipped and fell. Ellen Hoskins was watching me, I saw, with speculation in the set of her eyes, but she said nothing. Her brother nodded without much show of interest.
Put that down, Ellen, he said. More'n likely the professor's got something there.
Chapter 18. Anne's story was substantially the same as my own, of course. She told it in a low, steady voice that betrayed no emotion and in considerably fewer words than I had used. The sheriff listened to her with attention but no great show of interest. He did not interrupt at all, and, even when Anne reiterated my statement about the noise we had heard, he asked no question, though there was a quirk in Anne's tone when she called it thunder that I thought would arouse his vigilance. After she had finished, the big man sat silent for some time, slumped in his chair and staring at the rug. He lifted his eyes after a time and stared directly at Anne.
Miss Connor.
Yes?
When you came back from town with Dr. Rambouillet, was Mrs. Walters' dress wet?
Anne knitted her forehead for a second. No, she had on a different one. In the morning and early afternoon she was wearing a black crepe. When we came back, she'd changed into a dark blue wash silk she has. The sheriff grinned.
You got that, Ellen?
Naturally, I've got it. Her fingers moved like a pianist's when she was taking notes. She was never a word behind. I began to envy the Cambridge professor who had her for a secretary. Dan Hoskins seemed to have come to a dead end. He stretched his tree-trunk legs out in front of him and knocked the tips of his heavy shoes together slowly and rhythmically. It made a noise that was too loud for the hush of the room. The rest of us simply sat, waiting for his next move.
I'm a natural-born fool, I guess, he said. There ain't no real call I could see to keep you folks here any longer, or ask any more questions. Of course, I'll have to talk to Mrs. Walters before I go, but somehow I got a feeling...
His voice trailed off, and he went back to knocking the toes of his shoes together. Then he cleared his throat.
Miss Connor, he began almost diffidently, would you give me some kind of picture of how you folks are all connected?
Anne was surprised. You mean what relation we all are to each other?
He nodded. Something like that. More how you know each other, how it comes that you're all here at once in this house.
Oh. She began to explain that Julian was her brother-in-law, mentioned Helen's death, floundered through an awkward explanation about me, flushing when her voice stumbled, and added that when she'd arrived she'd found Mrs. Walters with Julian, and what she'd been able to gather about that. She's sort of an assistant of Uncle Julian's, was the way she'd summed it up, finally. That, it seemed to me, was a dangerous simplification. If the woman herself did not subsequently admit if the woman herself did not subsequently admit what she was, Julian himself was likely to do so, and I didn't want the sheriff to begin wondering later if we'd been holding things back from him all along the line. Besides, it seemed to me that I saw a safe way of explaining Mrs. Walters. In thinking it would simplify things at all, I was reasoning from an abysmal ignorance of Barsham Harbor and the way its people thought and felt. It would, perhaps, have been better if I'd kept my mouth shut then, but I wanted to forestall the obvious scandalous implications in Mrs. Walters' presence in the house. Wait a minute, Sheriff, I broke in. There's more to it than just that. He grunted.
There must be. They've been here alone, or pretty much that way, most of the summer.
Ellen Hoskins frowned. Really, Dan, I'm afraid you have an unpleasant imagination.
Never mind about my imagination. Human beings are human.
His tone was impatient but indulgent. What I was going to explain, I went on firmly, is this. When Mr. Blair's wife died, it hit him very hard. He's never really got over losing her. So he did something that even the greatest scientists have done more than once in the same situation. He turned to spiritualism. The big man snorted. In spite of my own convictions, which were all in agreement with him, the scorn and contempt he managed to make vocal in that short noise drove me to Julian's defense. All right, I said sharply. You've a right to despise the subject if you want, but there's nothing unusual or disgraceful in being a spiritualist. Lots of sane people are. I assure you. Even some scientists, as I said. And that's the explanation for Mrs. Walters. She's what is called a medium. Julian believes that he can communicate with Helen, with his dead wife, that is, through her. That's why she's here.
Have it your own way, Professor.
It's the truth, I said wearily. Of course it is, Dan. His sister's voice was quietly amused. In Barsham, Professor Sales, they relish their scandal, and Dan's no better than the rest. I thanked her with a smile, but what she said made me wonder whether I had been altogether wise. By the way, Sheriff, I told him, I don't know whether it will help particularly to have the fact of Mrs. Walters being a medium known. Perhaps it would be better not to mention it. He snorted again.
Don't worry, I ain't going to tell it. Folks would laugh at me for listening to such trash. Some of them, that is.
His voice lost its certainty.
And the others might not take kindly to the idea of having one of those things in these parts anyhow.
Thank you. I tried to sound ironical. He waved a large hand.
Don't mention it. Well, young lady, that's your story, eh?
Anne nodded. The sheriff pulled his watch out of his vest and looked at it.
Getting late. Early, I should say. But I calculate we may as well hear the others right now, if there's no objection. It'll save me a trip back later.
Certainly. I got to my feet. There was no sensation except that of leaden weight in my legs. At least I'll go call Mrs. Walters. I don't know about Julian. She may have given him a lot of opiate. The shock was severe, you know. I'm going to just reread this entire paragraph. Certainly. I got to my feet. There was no sensation except that of leaden weight in my legs. At least, I'll go call Mrs. Walters. I don't know about Julian. She may have given him a lot of opiate. The shock was severe, you know. He's still sleeping, and I wish you'd take him last, is all, if at all. And I wish you'd take him last, if at all.
Okay, let's have the woman first. You two don't need to wait up. Just send her on down and get some sleep. From the looks of you, it'd be a good idea.
His thinly veiled command was not as welcome as it should have been. I was dead tired. Fatigue had seeped into every cell of my nerves and muscles, and yet I did not want to leave that room. I wanted to watch the encounter between Dan Hoskins and Mrs. Walters. I wanted to be there in case she flared up and undid the job I had tried to do in presenting our story. I felt, without knowing quite why, that we were going to need the sheriff on our side, and I dreaded the prospect that Mrs. Walters would estrange him. But Anne was already on her feet and walking slowly toward the door. Clearly, there was no pretext by which we might stay, and perhaps it would be wiser to get some rest. We were likely to need it in the next few days. All right, I agreed. We'll call her and send her down to you. There's coffee on the stove if you need it. And wake me if I can help.
Sure,
he replied, and we went out together. Going up the stairs, Anne and I exchanged no words. I put my arm around her and steadied her, but there was no emotion connected with that. This sense of unreality and dream was upon me strongly then, and even Anne was a part of it. We were not real people, I thought, but only shadows on a screen or words on a page. We could not feel anything real. The sound of our feet on the treads seemed to come from a long way off. We knocked on Mrs. Walters' door. Her voice, when she answered, was not sleepy. "Hello," she said. "Who's there?" I told her and explained that she was wanted downstairs. "Wait 1 second till I come out," she said urgently through the door. "I want to talk to you for a minute." When she opened the door and came into the circle of our candle's light, it was plain that some time before she had been at least lying down in her blue dress. It was creased and wrinkled, and her hair straggled round her face. Most of the makeup was gone from her cheeks and lips, and she looked more than ever like a human ruin. But I swear there was no fear and no weakness in that face, or in the way she held her big, loose body. She stared at us each momentarily, as if trying to read from our faces what had been happening downstairs. It may even be possible that she was, but I think she had no occasion to wonder about that. I think she had been listening outside the door. She was too clever to leave anything to chance or guesswork, and she was in too tight a pinch to let even the smallest slip occur. "I hope you told the truth," she said to us in a low voice. "Of course," I could not resist it, adding, "and you'll be all right if you do the same thing." She smiled at that, and it was a thin, cold smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sayles. I was only hoping that you hadn't embroiled your story with noises, let us say, or stupid conjectures about me." I mentioned the noise as a clap of thunder, which I still don't believe it was, and we told Sheriff Hoskins that you were a medium. It seemed to me better to do that than to let him go on thinking what was actually in his mind. "How chivalrous of you." Without another word, she turned down the hall, moving in the dark like a cat, and went soundlessly down the stairs. Anne and I stood there in the dark hall until we heard a murmur of voices begin in the living room. Then we separated without a word or a gesture, and went at once to bed. This time I did not lie awake, even to listen. No matter what lived in this house, or what danger might be in its air, I could not think longer about it. Sleep came up over me at once, with Levian intensity. I probably mispronounced that last bit, but it's a reference to the river Lethe of of Greek myth. The dreams, River of Dreams, right? Sort of the twin to the river Styx. Chapter 19. The sun was shining when I woke the next day. For a time I lay on my cot, simply observing the intense blue of the sky coming through the window and feeling the animal pleasure of a rested body. When I stretched, the blood in the muscles of my arms and legs felt like rich cream. I was content, and even more than that. I thought of Anne. I would see her again on this day. No wonder the sky was so bright. And then I remembered everything else, in a series of heavy resurgences of memory, and the good feeling went out of me. It wasn't particularly cold when I got out of bed, so I knew the morning was probably well advanced. And when I went downstairs to forage for breakfast, I found it was close to 11. To my surprise, Julian was sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of coffee and picking at a piece of toast. "Hello, Julian," I said. "I see you slept late, too." He looked up at me, and I saw that his face was haggard and gray.
"Yes, later than I should have. I have no right to lose a morning in this fashion, but yesterday, seems to have been a shock to me."
"Did the sheriff wake you?"
"Yes, almost at dawn. I should have stayed up then and gone to work, I suppose, but I was tired."
The coffee on the stove was still hot. I poured a cup for myself, found some bread and butter and an orange, and sat down opposite him. "What did Hoskins ask you?"
"Routine questions. I had not heard about the accident until Mrs. Walters told me when she summoned me. It was tragic."
He massaged his face with his hand and took another sip of coffee.
"I would give anything if it had not happened."
"We all would give that, I guess." When he made no further comment, I asked, excuse me, one sec. My apologies. When he made no further comment, I asked, "Did you see the woman actually fall on the stairs, Julian?" His face was grayer than before, I thought, but his tone was steady.
"I was in my own bedroom, Richard. I couldn't have seen her fall."
"My theory is that it was the noise that frightened her into falling." He moistened his lips.
"So you heard that?"
"Of course. Listen, Julian, what made that sound? What made that noise?" Sorry. As if he had been rehearsed in the answer, he said,
"Thunder. It's often very loud and startling here in the valley."
I gave him a look which I hope expressed my skepticism and went on with my breakfast. "I suppose," I said at last, "you wouldn't be willing to use me as your assistant while I'm here, Julian. There's not much else to do, and we used to work well together in the old days." He smiled at that, and there was human warmth in the look he gave me.
"For an undergraduate, you were a remarkably capable laboratory man, Dick, but I don't need any help. It's best, I'm coming to believe, if I work wholly alone. And besides, I'm relying on you to give Anne some fun."
"I'd have time to do both."
"No, Dick, no." He looked at me somberly. "What do you think of her?"
"She's a good kid."
He nodded. "And a lovely one, too, Dick, if I should ever have And a lovely one, too. Dick, if I should ever have an accident, say like Mrs. Marcy, and fall downstairs, I want to ask you to keep an eye on Anne. I've bequeathed what little property I have left to her in my will. You're the executor."
"But, Julian," he held up a thin hand.
"Don't protest. There is no one else I could ask to do it."
"All right," I said. "I'll do my best."
"That's all I want,"
he said, and finished his coffee. The piece of toast which he had been holding when I came in was almost untouched. I wanted to urge him to eat more, but from the way he shoved it back, I was sure it would be useless.
"Well, Dick, it's good to have you here. Perhaps I did not sound too cordial yesterday, and I'm sorry.
You're a comfort to us right now, though. I'm only sorry all this should have happened." I told him not to worry and that it was nothing, and he moved out of the room. Even before I had finished speaking, I could tell that his mind was abstracted, that he only half heard me, and as he went through the door, his head was bent forward as I remembered it when he went into the lab in the old days. Without his telling me, I was sure he was going to that room of his where he worked, and the thought gave me a twinge of uneasiness. Surely there were more important things to settle today, but I did not try to call him back. He had gone beyond me, beyond every other living person as well, I think. There was no way I could have held on to him. Even if I had known then what was to happen in the next 48 hours, I could not have held him back. Julian, in those last days, was scarcely a living person at all, as I have come to realize in thinking back over the whole terrible story. He was alive only because of the purpose that was in him, the determination to perfect that device of his before letting the death that was in every fiber of his body actually triumph. After I had finished eating and washing my cup and saucer, I went outside. The sun was blazing down with a thin, sharp sort of autumn heat which felt good on my neck and shoulders. There was a chill in that house behind me that never wholly left it. Apparently, the storm had blown itself out. There were a few clouds far to the east, but elsewhere the blue was unbroken. I let my eye range north to where the Marcy house stood, but there was no apparent movement around it. After a while, a car came crawling down the road and turned into the drive, but that was all. That, and the fact that there was no one in the fields around the place, and no sound of any sort. It was a Sunday silence, but it wasn't Sunday. I strolled aimlessly across the grass and down toward the bay. Looking at water is one of my favorite ways of doing nothing. Even if the thought of swimming was ridiculously inappropriate, and in spite of the fact that I should have loathed the sight of the river because it had just killed a woman the night before, it seemed better to stroll toward the bay than up the road past the ominous silence of the Marcy house. So I went toward the bay. The grass was quite dry. The grass was quite dry again, and the ground no longer muddy. Everything was so precisely the way it had been yesterday, I could hardly believe that the things my memory told me had occurred were possible. Even when I remembered them most actively, they were not altogether real, as the sun, the grass, the blue sparkle of the water was real. Anne was sitting on the bank over the swimming beach. She was wearing a tweed coat with a pattern that looked loud to my conservative masculine eyes, and a plain dark brown skirt. The sun was in her hair and lying gold on the skin of her neck and hands and bare legs. She was kicking against the cut bank with the heels of her sports shoes and staring out over the water. I dropped down beside her. "Hello." "Hi." The ensuing silence lasted a long time. Finally, she sighed and said, "It's hard to believe it all, isn't it?" "Yes." "Who'd you see this morning?" she went on after a while. "Walters?" "No. I had breakfast with Julian. Then I came on out here. I didn't want to hang around the house. I didn't see her at all." "I did," said Anne. "Something's wrong there. She's desperately unhappy about yesterday, I suppose. Or else something that happened this morning." "What?" I couldn't feel much interested. Anne shook her head. "I don't know. I just wondered if you'd noticed it. Did Uncle Julian tell you the inquest is this afternoon?" "No. Is it?" She nodded. "We're all to go. At least so Mrs. Walters says. I had breakfast with her. It wasn't cozy. She only spoke to me once, and then it was to tell me that." She pulled a stem of grass and put it between her teeth. It was so much like yesterday that I felt confused for a moment, as though time had slipped, or I had become misplaced in it. Anne went on after a time. "She looked as if she had been crying. I think perhaps she and Uncle Julian had words this morning. Anyhow, she went into his room earlier to see if he was awake, and she was gone quite a while. I could hear their voices through the door, but not what they were saying." She nipped the grass stem again. "It would be fine if they really quarreled and Uncle Julian sent her away." Her mood struck me as odd, but my own was no more explicable. We both felt detached, passive, wholly centered in the moment. The past and the future were equally uncomfortable, and so we were just existing as nearly as possible in a pure present. There was nothing in our words or actions that morning to suggest that we were more than the most casual acquaintances, and most of the time, I think, we were hardly aware of each other. Most of the time. But there were the moments when I would notice the light in her hair, or the faint fragrance of the perfume she was wearing, and I would be aware of her all right. She hardly looked at me. We stayed there by the water till 1 o'clock, and by the time we returned to the house, lunch was on the table. A vile meal it was, too. Canned peas, some warmed-over stew, and pale, yellow, slippery canned peaches that reminded me of college commons. I looked curiously at Mrs. Walters while I was putting down as much of the food as I could manage. She was obviously outfitted for town, in a stiff blue dress. Her hair was more carefully arranged than I had yet seen it, and her makeup was straight again. But there was a sullenness in her manner, even toward Julian, and she obviously resented all of us. "You might have come in sooner," she said to Anne. "I had to get the lunch single-handed." And to me, "I made your bed, Professor Sales, but if you want any more tidying up than that, you'll have to do it yourself." As I recall, she did not address a single word to Julian. There was something defiant about him. He ate more than he had at breakfast, rather as if to avoid the necessity for speaking than as if he were hungry. He must have been working hard. There was a black smudge on one cheek, the one he always rubbed when he was concentrating, I remembered, and his hands were grimy. After the meal, Anne went over to him and gave him a kiss on the top of his head. "Now, Uncle Julian," she said, "you go up and wash your hands, fix your hair, and put on a tie. Dick and I aren't going to take you to town looking like a mechanic." "But that's what I am, my dear," he said absently. All the same, he got up and went obediently out. Mrs. Walters followed him without a word to either of us, but the look she gave Anne was eloquent. Anne grinned sweetly back at her and went on collecting the plates. I felt the usual helpless embarrassment of the male caught in the crossfire of a woman's skirmish. When the door closed behind Mrs. Walters, Anne gave me a grimace that was funny enough to make me laugh. I hoped that Mrs. Walters didn't hear it, but I suspect she did. The kitchen, though, was a cheerful place after Julian and Mrs. Walters had left. Anne and I washed the dishes slowly because it was something to do, and had a good time till the last one was racked away. Then there was nothing to think of but the trip into town. We left the house about 2:30, and the ride was a stiffly silent one. Julian sat with Anne in front, and Mrs. Walters and I occupied opposite corners of the back seat. We neither looked nor spoke at each other in the course of the drive. All four of us were preoccupied with what was to come, and yet, though we knew that we were going to face the hostility of all Barsham Harbor, we were not united by the opposition we were to confront. This, I thought, is no way to go into a thing of this sort. But I could not see what to do about it, so I kept silent. As we passed the road into Seth Marcy's farm, a car swung out of it and followed after us. It came in so patly that I felt the driver had been waiting for our car to appear. Once Anne slowed down and pulled over to let it get ahead, but whoever was driving refused to go past. He kept his car an even distance behind us all the way into town. Chapter 20. The inquest was to be held in a courtroom on the second floor of the county building. We had no trouble in finding a parking place, and as we stepped out of our Ford, the following car drove up behind us. It was the taxi in which I had ridden from the station the morning before. Seth Marcy got out of it, and so did the driver, whom I recognized at once. They stared at us without any expression and waited till we entered the building and started up the stairs. Then they came after us, walking with the slow, loose-jointed stride of countrymen. I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck. We found seats toward the front of the room and sat down. It was rather a dingy, large courtroom, and there must have been well over 100 people in it, even before the presiding magistrate. Whoever he was arrived. I presume he was the coroner, but I don't know his name and never did. The irrelevant details of a situation like ours don't impinge much on your mind. Dan Hoskins was there, of course, and I saw Dr. Rambouillet sitting across the aisle from us. It was some time before I noticed Ellen Hoskins. She was sitting at a table with a man who looked like the court clerk, methodically sharpening a pencil with a pocket sharpener. Most of the time before the hearing opened, I spent looking at the people in the courtroom. They were a grim lot, on the whole. We New Yorkers become used to audiences which have a good deal of more or less ebullient blood in them. Italians, Spanish, all sorts of foreigners who still have not become typical Americans. Here, it was different. These people were all of the same stock and startlingly alike underneath their superficial differences. They were, on the average, tall and inclined to thinness. Their faces were sharp and gray or weathered. Men and women, they had a look of being on the defensive toward life in some way that I could not define. They were inclined to shabbiness, again by New York standards, and there was a faint truculence about the way they sat and the looks they cast in our direction. Good people they might be, but narrow and cold was the way they looked. I thought as I surveyed them that it was lucky we were innocent of any sort of wrongdoing. It would be hard to find an impartial jury among a people like this. The jury was, actually, a cross-section of the spectators. It was wholly composed of men, most of them apparently farmers, and all middle-aged or older. They were not in the least ill at ease in the jury box. Now and then a dry smile would cross the face of one of them, a long-boned fellow with a Mackinaw jacket who sat at the end of the second row, when he caught sight of someone he knew in the audience. But it seemed to me, looking at them, that they were serious and dignified about what they had been called upon to do. The formal proceedings began almost on time. The magistrate seemed to have no particular plan of inquiry. He took evidence first of all from the man who had found the body, Harry Miller. His testimony was nothing more than what Ellen Hoskins had told us the night before. Then Dr. Peters was called to testify, and here the examining officer showed a nice sense of economy by using the doctor first to identify the body and then to describe the medical aspects of its condition. Some of what he had to say belongs in this record, though it has already been suggested. Dr. Peters was a large, dignified medico with white hair and a weighty gold watch chain. As the dean of Barsham Harbor doctors and coroner's physician as well, As the dean of the Barsham Harbor doctors and coroner's physician as well, he spoke with a good deal of dignity, and weighted his sentences with technical words and terms even when they were not necessary. He reported that when he first examined the body of Mrs. Marcy, she was already dead. I felt an insane desire to smile at that.
Can you give us the precise cause of death, Dr. Peters?
The coroner's tone was deferential. Dr. Peters looked grave.
The cause of death might briefly be described as internal injuries, he declared. That is, hemorrhage resulting from such injuries.
He proceeded to launch into a Virgilian cascade of Latin terms, of which I recognized only a few, including the astounding fact that Mrs. Marcy had received an apparently terrible blow across the chest, which had resulted in a fractured sternum or breastbone and a ruptured spleen. Further, both her arms had been broken. A ripple went through the courtroom at his testimony. I knew that it took me wholly by surprise, and even the coroner appeared incredulous.
And you do not believe, Dr. Peters, that the deceased met her death by drowning?
Dr. Peters looked pained.
I have testified as to the cause, or causes, of death. None of the symptoms of drowning were present. There was no froth in the deceased's mouth or nose, nor even in the trachea and bronchial tubes. Neither was there water in the stomach.
He paused and cleared his throat.
The definitive test for drowning is the Gettler test. It depends upon a chemical analysis of blood taken from the pulmonary vein. If pulmonary blood contains a higher percentage of salt than the normal, the diagnosis is death from drowning in salt water. If the blood contains a lower salt content than the normal, the diagnosis is, of course, drowning, more technically asphyxiation, from submersion in fresh water. In the case of the deceased, I did not apply the Gettler test.
He paused, and the coroner supplied the cue for which he was palpably waiting.
Can you tell the court why you did not apply the Gettler test, Dr. Peters? I can. There were two reasons. One, that the pulmonary vein had been ruptured as a result of the injuries which I have already described. The other, that the deceased entered the river at a time and point when the water was, in view of the conditions of the tide, brackish.
He brought the word out with a
brackish.
There we go. He brought the word out with a fine flourish of the tongue.
We're going to do that again, dramatically, with a flourish. I can. There were two reasons. One, that the pulmonary vein had been ruptured as a result of the injuries which I have already described. The other, that the deceased entered the river at a time and point when the water was, in view of the condition of the tide, brackish.
He brought the word out with a fine flourish of the tongue.
In my opinion, the test would have been of no practical value.
That was Dr. Peters' testimony, though it took much longer to deliver than to summarize. I listened to it with amazement. It seemed to me entirely incredible that Mrs. Marcy should not have died as all of us had assumed she did. And yet, in spite of his bombast, Dr. Peters was clearly testifying with knowledge and authority. Pompous he might be, but I could not believe that he was ignorant of his facts. I stole a look at Dr. Rambouillet, but that young man's dark, handsome face was composed. Apparently he saw nothing in what his colleague was saying, at which to cavil. Cavil? All right, sometimes we have to look words up. I've read this before, but I cannot remember what this word means. Give me a moment. Let's find out. Intransitive verb, to argue or find fault over trivial matters, raise petty objections. Synonym, quibble. Definition 2, to quibble about, point out petty flaws in. Definition 3, to raise captious and frivolous objections, to find fault without good reason. This has been your education, learning, teachable moment, courtesy of William Sloane. Where were we? Apparently, he saw nothing in what his colleague was saying at which to cavil. Where's that cavil? Cavil. Yep. The coroner was puzzled. The coroner was as puzzled as the rest of us. He asked Dr. Peters if he had any idea what could have occasioned the numerous injuries he had described. Dr. Peters pointed out that his province was not speculation, but that the injuries were consonant with the deceased's having been struck violently across the thoracic or chest region by a bar or the edge of a plank. Although, he concluded, a fall against such an edge as I have mentioned might have produced the same result, provided the deceased had fallen from a sufficient height. He added that he had no reason to assume such a fall. In reply to a question from the coroner, he admitted that he had been the deceased's personal physician
since the day she was born,
and that he knew of no complaint which would have rendered her liable to sudden dizziness or to fainting. When he finally stepped down from the stand, my mind was in turmoil. If Mrs. Marcy was not alive when she went into the river, then how explain 1,000 things? Her regaining consciousness, for instance. Her walk toward her home. When and under what circumstances had she died? Obviously not in our house, nor as a result of her fall on the stairs. Though I wondered numbly whether the edge of a stair tread could have inflicted the injuries which Dr. Peters had described. It seemed impossible, and yet... Seth Marcy was the next witness, and he made a bitter one. He described his long wait for his wife's return, his eventual decision to come after her, and his summoning Anne and myself to the back door.
"A lamp was still burning in their kitchen," he said. "Tell me why that was. It was the only time she left it on. You can't get around that. They're hiding something, and I look to this trial to get it out of them."
The coroner rapped with his gavel.
"No, Seth, this ain't a trial, and you've got to be careful about accusing people."
Seth's voice flushed dark, but he said nothing more, returned a few sullen answers to minor questions, and stepped down from the witness chair. As he strode along the aisle to his seat, he almost brushed against Mrs. Walters, and his thin, hooked mouth went down at one corner.
"You dirty whore," he said out of the corner of it.
He said out of the corner of it, in a low voice,
"You'll pay for this."
Then he was past her and into his seat behind us. Mrs. Walters said nothing, but her face went white, and I saw that she was trembling. There was an anger in her eyes that was terrible. I would not have chosen to incur Seth Marcy's hatred, but I'd have taken it any day in preference to the ice-cold wrath that looked out of Mrs. Walters' eyes. Our turns came next. Mine was first. I told the same story I had given Dan Hoskins, but I put as much emphasis as I could upon the thunderclap. The fact that I was a college professor and one from a New York university did not seem to please most of the courtroom. There were sneers on several faces confronting me. When I admitted that I had no idea how Mrs. Marcy had met so terrible and violent a death, the taxi driver laughed contemptuously and loud enough so that I heard him. It was possible, I suggested, that in falling from the bank she had struck against a ledge of rock, but I admitted that I had not noticed such a rock at the place where Mrs. Marcy had fallen. I added that the evidence of the footprints, which I described in as much detail as I could remember, was plain, and emphasized that Seth Marcy had been as convinced of their authenticity as I was. I pointed out that he had followed them in advance of Miss Connor and myself. It was surprising how much latitude the coroner permitted. He interrupted seldom and allowed me to tell our side of the story without correction.
"Thank you, Professor Sayles,"
he said when I had finished.
"I reckon you've told us what we want to know."
"Well, what he wants us to know," said a voice from one of the benches toward the rear of the room. The coroner pounded with his gavel. "Silence! This is a court of law. If there ain't decent order here, the room will be cleared." With that, I went back to my seat, and it was Anne's turn next. She told the same story that I had, and again there were no questions. I began to feel uneasy. There was a growing air of hostility in the room which was inescapable, and I wondered why we were given so much latitude. It seemed to me that the coroner would naturally try to please the people to whom he owed his office, after all, by giving us an uncomfortable time of it. But on the contrary, he was quietly kind to Anne. I looked at her on that raised chair and felt my heart contract within me. She didn't belong there. Her clothes, bright and smart by comparison with what any other woman in the room was wearing, were too gay for Barsham Harbor. Her hair was too gold, too much like sun in a room that was not meant to be other than shadowy. She was too lovely a contrast with the people who were here to look at us and judge by their own harsh standards. Beauty is a hateful thing if it is of a kind to shame you. and Anne seemed to me to shame these people. They stared at her with a sort of impudent curiosity, or at least the men did. That made me inwardly furious. The women stared coldly at her, but there was no mercy in their eyes. Anne's voice was low and steady. She behaved as if she were accustomed to giving evidence, and her story was clear and direct. She told it her own way, too. I think no one would have been willing to believe that we had rehearsed our evidence beforehand. When she finished, she turned to the coroner. "I don't know if what I'm going to say belongs in your records, but I do want to say that this thing that has happened is horrible and that we all feel terribly about it. Elora and I were friends, really. She was an adorable person. I wish it hadn't happened. That's all." The coroner thanked her, and she stepped down to a buzz of low-voiced comment in the room. I could not tell exactly what they thought of her, but I suspected it was the inevitable judgment. That is, the men were half won over by her sincerity, but the women contemptuous. At least one thin, blousy housewife a few seats away muttered something to the pallid man beside her, which sounded like baggage. I find it hard to convey the inquest as it seemed to me while it was going on. My own emotions were too chaotic for exact definition. They were a blend of confusion underlaid by fear, of uncertainty, of surprise, of gnawing anxiety as to what all this was going to mean for Anne, Julian, and myself. Bitter regret that I had not secured a lawyer, and over them all, a sort of numbness. The whole thing was too far outside anything that had happened to me before. I felt responsible for the group of us. It was up to me more than anyone else to see that we came out of this mess without tragedy, and yet I felt helpless to alter the course of events. Never, in the most unfamiliar parts of Europe, had I felt so alien as I did there in that main courtroom. The lot of us were simply cut off from everyone else. When the coroner had reproved Seth Marcy for calling the inquest a trial, he was only technically correct, for we were really on trial in the eyes of Barsham Harbor. One of their own people had died a horrible and inexplicable death, and we were somehow mixed up in it. We were outlanders. They meant to be sure that we did not get away with it. I squeezed Anne's hand when she sat down beside me. "Good work." She did not reply. Her lips were pressed together hard. And her fingers gripped mine. I knew that she wanted to cry and wouldn't permit herself to do so. Then Mrs. Walters was called to the stand. Instantly, the buzz of comment took on a new note, more sibilant, deeper in tone. They had been waiting for her. Chapter 21. Mrs. Walters took her place with an unruffled composure, gave her name and address without being asked for them, and settled herself in the witness chair. The coroner looked over at her above the rim of his glasses.
"What is your position in Mr. Blair's household?"
he began at once. "I am Mr. Blair's housekeeper and assistant."
"How long have you occupied that position, Mrs. Walters?"
"Over 3 years."
"I see. What do your duties as assistant consist of?"
"I help Mr. Blair with his experiments." The same voice in the rear of the room which had heckled me suggested, "Ask her what her duties are as housekeeper, then." The coroner's gavel was peremptory.
"That's enough of that, Hank Mason. If you can't remain silent, you'll have to leave this hearing."
but the muscles at the corners of his mouth were twitching. Mrs. Walters said quietly, "I will answer any question which is put to me, but so far as I know, I am not on trial here. I do not see why I should tolerate insults." Now, said the coroner, "please speak only in answer to my questions. Tell us what you personally saw of the accident to Mrs. Marcy." Mrs. Walters' response was instantaneous. "Nothing directly. Mrs. Marcy had finished cleaning the room where Mr. Blair and I work. She was on her way back, I suppose, to the kitchen. But there was a sudden, very loud clap of thunder, and it seemed to me I heard also a faint sort of cry. I left the room where I was and went to the head of the stairs. Apparently, Mr. Blair heard the cry too, because we met at the head of the stairs. When we looked down, there was Mrs. Marcy lying at the bottom. For a moment, we were too surprised and alarmed to do anything. Then we went down the stairs. We stood there a moment, looking down at her, and Mr. Sayles and Miss Connor came in." She told the rest of the story substantially as she had before, putting great emphasis upon the fact that she would not have let Mrs. Marcy leave if she had not been sure that she was fully recovered, and, even so, that she had gone part of the way with her. She admitted that she had been at fault in letting Mrs. Marcy go at all, but declared that the woman had insisted. "It's easy enough to see now that what I should have done," she concluded, "but it wasn't so easy then. People fall more or less all the time, and usually without any serious damage. I have had some nursing experience. I was satisfied that she was all right, but if there is any blame, I am willing to take it." When she said that, it seemed to me that her eyes were fastened on Julian, but he did not acknowledge her glance in any way. "When you carried Mrs. Marcy to the sofa," the coroner said, "did you examine her in any detail? Can you tell us, that is, if she had any of the injuries which Dr. Peters described, and which I am sure you heard?" Mrs. Walters shook her head contemptuously. "If she had, I would never have let her leave the house, and she could not have left it either, because she would have been dead. Dr. Peters testified that she died of those injuries, but she did not get them from whatever accident she had in our house. She may have struck a rock in her fall into the river. I don't know how she got them." Seth Marcy stood up in his seat. His face was livid, and the finger he shook at her trembled. "You lie, and you know it. Why was her light left burning in the kitchen, right where she always puts it? Answer me that if you can." He sat down again, shaking with hate, and behind him a murmur of approval rose from the room. Mrs. Walters was calm, while the coroner pounded for quiet. "Let the court put the questions," he shouted as soon as he could make himself heard. "This here's a court of law." He turned to Mrs. Walters. "I was coming to that question next. Seth Marcy testified his wife used to leave the lamp in your kitchen burning in the window till she started for home. Then she would put it out, and Seth knew she'd leave your place. Then she would put it out, and Seth knew she'd left your place. You knew of this arrangement?" "Certainly." "Then how do you explain the fact that you arranged the lamp so as to give Mrs. Marcy's signal to Seth?" The look Mrs. Walters gave the coroner and the court was full of the most contemptuous scorn I have ever seen. "Why," she said, as if speaking to a class of stupid children, "I thought of course that she was already home. I left the lamp lighted for my own convenience in case I had to get something later for Mr. Blair. Seth Marcy is making something up out of the whole cloth. If he had the least intelligence, he would see that there was no sense in what he's been saying." "Please stick to the questions I ask you, Mrs. Walters. This court isn't to find out what you think of Seth Marcy, or any of the rest of us, for that matter." A murmur of satisfaction rose from the room, and I damned Mrs. Walters under my breath. She was not doing us any good, and I knew that the rest of us would be judged by her. These people would tolerate no arbitrary words from any of us, but least of all from her. She was the focal point of their scorn and hate. When the room had quieted once more, the coroner went on with his examination, but it was plain that he was at a loss. He no longer knew what questions to ask. The evidence was at an impasse. Mrs. Marcy had not drowned, but had been killed by a blow or a fall. She had fallen in our house, but her injuries could not have been sustained there because she had been able to walk home. Mrs. Walters was stubborn in her testimony. After a time, he gave it up and dismissed her from the stand. The confusion in his mind was apparent in his next act, which was to call Dan Hoskins to the stand and question him about the footprints. The big sheriff was terse and direct in his evidence. He declared that although the rain had somewhat defaced the prints, he had tested them with Mrs. Marcy's shoes.
Yes, the ones she had on when we found her.
And a pair which Mrs. Walters had given him early that morning. He was in no doubt but that the prints had been made by the two women. The trail was an easy one to follow, and its meaning inescapable. Oh, hello, Frank Misers. Thanks for tuning in.
You believe, then, the coroner demanded, that the previous witness's story is correct?
The sheriff nodded slowly.
I ain't got no choice but to believe it. The shoes fit the prints, and you can see what was happening to her practically every foot of the way. Them prints are still there. I've looked at 'em twice. You can't get away from 'em.
The coroner went on to examine the big man about the way in which he had heard of the accident, his connection with the search, his inspection of the ground, and his interrogation of us. As I listened to Dan Hoskins' replies, I came to understand why Anne and I, at least, had been so gently handled in the examination. He was obviously concerned to make plain his conviction that we were not involved in anything criminal.
These folks gave me straight answers, so far as I'm a judge, he said once, and again, there ain't any evidence I can see against anybody, at least so far.
I knew that he was speaking not to the court, but to the courtroom, and the heavy silence with which his audience listened to him indicated how little they liked what he was saying.
Maybe these folks were kind of careless, the sheriff declared at the end of his testimony. That's the worst I can say in the light of the evidence.
Have you any theory as to how Mrs. Marcy came by the injuries Dr. Peters described? The coroner's voice was openly puzzled. Dan Hoskins shook his head.
I guess Professor Sales is right. She must have hit a rock ledge. The current there could slam a body against the stone with terrible force, I calculate. If you ask me, she was unconscious but alive when she went into the water, or maybe just conscious enough to fight a little against the water. Inside the first few seconds, the river slammed her up against the rock.
The coroner thanked the sheriff and recalled Dr. Peters. He was questioned at some length as to whether the sheriff's explanation were a possible one. This time the doctor was not so positive. He admitted that with a chest injury of the extent he had found, there was no likelihood that Mrs. Marcy would have drowned, in the technical sense. He said he believed the injuries had been sustained before she went into the water at all, but declared that it would be impossible to testify certainly on this point. He could, however, say, with assurance, that Mrs. Marcy must have been struck immediately after she entered the river, for there was no water in her lungs. And undoubtedly instinctive breathing would have forced her to draw breath within a minute, thereby pumping water into the lungs and stomach. He gave it as his opinion that she would not have been capable of drawing a breath after the injury. By this time, even the slowest thinkers in the spectators had begun to see the intricacy of the problem. There were head-scratchings on the part of the men and a steady hiss of whispers from the women. My own confusion had been supplanted by a deep feeling of alarm. Something had happened to Mrs. Marcy which was not yet explained. What it was I could not begin to imagine, but it must be connected either with Seth Marcy or with us. Seth was a brooding, angry man. Everything that I had seen of him made me positive that he was capable of violence, even to his wife. On the other hand, if his actions when he discovered what had happened to Elora were forced and nothing but pretense, then he was a superb actor. Beyond all that, there was the evidence of the footprints. On the other hand, both Anne and myself were clearly not connected with whatever had actually happened. I, at least, could be wholly positive about that, which left Julian and Mrs. Walters. Julian was, I considered, out of the question. My thoughts had reached this point when he was called to the stand. Julian's testimony was curious. He gave it in a thin, uncertain voice which must have made a bad impression on the coroner. Certainly it did on his audience. He began by declaring that he had been in his room when the burst of thunder of which we had all spoken occurred. He had come out into the hall with a sense of vague alarm and found Mrs. Walters hurrying toward the stairs. He had seen Mrs. Marcy lying at their foot.
"I was, of course, horrified," he said.
"I was, of course, horrified." He said the words as if he did not entirely mean them.
"I am afraid that I did not make any close examination of Mrs. Marcy or participate in what the others were doing to help her. It was a great shock. It was a great shock."
His voice quavered when he said that. He meant the last few words, at least, I decided. "Mr. Blair," the coroner began after a pause, "you are a scientist?"
"I am."
"Would you tell us why you came to Barsham Harbor?" Julian looked trapped. His eyes flickered round the room, and he moved his hands nervously on the arms of his witness chair.
"Why, for no special reason. That is, I wanted a place as isolated from large cities and power lines as possible. The location of my house is ideal for my purposes."
"In what way?" The coroner seemed determined to pursue the subject. Julian drew a long breath and said,
"My work is concerned with delicate electrical impulses. If you like, they may be compared to very faint radio waves. I was anxious to carry on my researches as far as possible from heavy-duty electric machinery of all kinds and other disturbing influences. That is why I came to Maine. That, and its isolation from the more populous parts of the country. I am both a scientist and an inventor. Secrecy, in the early stages of research, is important."
Well, it's a good thing he didn't come to Maine in current era, because I believe they still are beholden to one Central Maine Power, one of the most amazing power companies in the entire country. Maybe not quite as bad as that time Enron was jiggering with California power rates. It's not quite that bad, but not much better, at least when I was there. Maybe they're better now. I kind of doubt it. Anyway. The coroner said, "Thank you," in an unsatisfied tone. He looked hard at Julian. "Would you be willing to tell us the nature of the problem you're working on now, Mr. Blair?"
"I would prefer not to do so, except to say that it involves research into very minute electric impulses."
"Was Mrs. Marcy aware of the nature of your work?" Julian looked surprised.
"It never occurred to me to wonder. I do not see how she could have been."
The coroner frowned. "When this work of yours is completed, Mr. Blair, will it have any commercial applications?" For the first time, I noticed that the coroner was reading these questions from a slip of paper on the bench before him. I looked at Dan Hoskins. He was listening to Julian with complete concentration, and I saw that Ellen Hoskins' pencil was racing across the paper in front of her. It had occurred to me for an instant that perhaps these questions had been supplied to the coroner by the sheriff. I discarded the thought. Their very phrasing was against such an assumption. But Ellen Hoskins might have written them. Julian looked still more surprised.
"I do not see what all this has to do with Mrs. Marcy." "I do not see what all this has to do with Mrs. Marcy," he declared in the firmest tones he had yet used. "But although I have not thought about the commercial applications of my research, I can say that I do not believe they will be very widespread. By that, I mean that my goal is not an ordinary commercial one. It is more—" He paused and groped for the next word. "Humanitarian. And for me," he added with an undertone of defiance behind his words, "the problem does not arise in any case. I intend to make the discoveries which arise out of my work public property the moment I am convinced they are sufficiently advanced to do so."
Then I knew. In a single flash of intuition, I saw one of the strains which was operating in that household of ours on the point. The clue was the sudden stiffening of Mrs. Walter's back as Julian delivered his last sentence. Her eyes narrowed, and she stared at him angrily. She did not want that mad invention of his made public. Furthermore, she believed it would work, and she was angry at the thought of Julian's giving it to the world. For a moment, I was incredulous. She couldn't really think that thing would do what Julian expected. She must have joined forces with him originally on a very different assumption, that he was an ideal client who would pay well and go on paying as long as she could consciously, or perhaps it was subconsciously, delude him. But now she believed that he would succeed, and she was determined that when he did, he would not turn over his discoveries to the world. It was a terrific commercial opportunity, of course. Julian was quite wrong on that point, at least. In one flash, I saw the whole thing as it would be: the duplication and secrecy of Julian's machine, the advertising, the publicity, the carefully publicized proofs of the invention's actual validity, the long and pitiful queues of people who were bereaved, waiting to pay for the privilege of a few minutes' intercourse with those they had lost. A blackness came in front of my eyes. I felt suddenly dizzy, and, more than that, afraid. Odd that in all the talk with Julian and all the high-flown things that Mrs. Walters had said to me, I had not once felt a real conviction of the possibility that Julian would succeed. But in that clash of anger and wills in the court, I saw a stronger rebuttal to my skepticism than in anything which had gone before. Both Julian and Mrs. Walters were convinced, so convinced that they were already at odds over a future of the machine which Julian had fathered. He had actually done it then. And even as I thought that, a revulsion occurred in my mind. "By God," I told myself, "you're crazy. He can't have. It's utterly and absolutely impossible." Don't mind my sinuses. There's a big weather front moving through, so they're doing fun things.
You might hear them pop occasionally.
Chapter 22. The coroner was persistent. "What I am getting at, Mr. Blair, is the question of whether, if Mrs. Marcy had known of your work, she could have given away its secret, or in any way affected the progress of your research." Julian frowned.
"My working model," he declared, "is so complex that I doubt whether more than a few people in the entire country could grasp its nature, even after prolonged examination. I do not see how Mrs. Marcy could have understood it in the slightest." And yet Julian, the most ignorant savage, quickly finds out about a rifle, even if his most prolonged examination will not reveal the nature of that deadly tool. It was typical of you to assume that no one could know a thing unless he understood how and why it worked. But people do not think that way. They see only what it does, and understand the forces and instruments of their world by their effects, not the principles which lie behind them. Apparently the coroner had come to the end of his questions. He hesitated, and I saw him glance down at Dan Hoskins, who gave an imperceptible shake of his head. Whereupon Julian was excused from the witness chair. I just lost my place. Where did I go? Whereupon Julian was excused from the witness chair. Then followed one of the most curious speeches I have ever heard. The coroner addressed the jury as if they could help him resolve the problem which confronted him. He reminded them that they had seen the body and that it was their duty to decide how Mrs. Marcy had come to die. If they felt that she had met her death by misadventure, or accident, that is,
they were to find a verdict to that effect. If, on the other hand, and here he shrugged, they had any idea that she had died as the result of negligence or deliberate intention on the part of some person or persons, they would bring in a verdict to that effect. He himself could not comment on the evidence beyond remarking that it was contradictory and confusing. On the other hand, there appeared to be no ground for suspicion that anyone could have desired the death of Elora Marcy or stood to profit from it in any way. While the witnesses from the house where she worked had admitted to a certain lack of suitable caution in letting her leave their house, there was apparently some reason to suppose that almost anyone would have done the same thing in their place. The evidence which Dr. Peters had presented was one thing they had to bear in mind, and another was the evidence of the sheriff and the footprints. It went on like that for some time, and had I been on that jury, I would have been puzzled to know what sort of verdict the coroner expected me to reach. He simply laid his own perplexity in their laps and said, in effect, "I don't know what to make of this, but maybe you do. Anyhow, you've got to bring in a verdict." The jury was out for a long time. At least it seemed so to all of us. When they filed back into the court, there was a look of sheepishness on most of their faces. The foreman stood up with some embarrassment.
"We've talked this thing over, Ben," he said to the coroner, "and we don't figure to know any more about it than you do. So we kind of reached a compromise. We find the deceased met her death as the result of internal injuries like Doc Peters said, but we don't know how she come by 'em."
He sat down and wiped his forehead with a blue bandana handkerchief. A babble of talk burst out in the room behind us. Everyone stood. That's babble as in the biblical one, Bab-El. "Ye old tower, we're gonna go check out heaven." And God was like, "Ha ha ha ha, no."
"I said don't." Smiterated.
A babel of talk burst out in the room behind us. Everyone stood up at once and began shuffling, not back toward the door, but down forward where we were sitting. The final words of the coroner were lost in the general noise. Almost at once, Dan Hoskins was standing at the end of our bench, beckoning to us.
"This way. You better go out the side door."
We followed him without further urging. None of us wanted to stay behind in that crowd. The noise at our backs was louder, and there were some shouts which I could not make out. We found ourselves almost at once passing through what must have been a judge's chambers, and then down a private stair of some sort. Julian and Mrs. Walters were the first in the single file by which we descended, and I brought up the rear. Although no one came after us, the skin on my back crawled as we went. The sheriff wiped his own forehead when we reached the sidewalk.
"Get in your car right off," he said, "and go on home. I'll expect all of you to stay there till you hear from me. And listen, for God's sakes, be careful what you say and do. I never seen folks so stirred up."
Our car was almost opposite the door by which we came out. I drove, with Anne beside me, and we went down to the highway by back streets. The impulse to stamp on the throttle was panic-strong in me, but I managed to resist it. We rolled out along the edge of the bay at 45, and as Barsham Harbor dropped behind us, I began to breathe without feeling as if a bar of iron were clamped around my chest. Anne's face beside me was white, but she lit a cigarette with steady fingers. "Fools," said Mrs. Walters after a time. "Small-town, ignorant fools, that's what they are." None of us could think of a suitable comment to that, and we drove on in silence. "That sheriff better keep them in order," she went on after a silence. Oh, Frank Misers has been busy. Frank Misers says, "Guess what I found out today? I found out that Washington, D.C. is not actually located in the state of Washington." Oh, no, yes, it's true. Yes, this is correct. I can imagine this would be confusing. I had always believed that it did since I was about 10. Kid logic. No. Sane logic. So imagine my bafflement when I went to compare the Fallout 3 map to the IRL map. I started looking in the state of Washington and was looking for DC for 15 minutes, absolutely confused. For 30 years, this notion remained uncorrected. It made me question all my assumptions for a moment. I wondered about the reaction from an American to that. Totally understandable. I'm pretty sure as a child I thought so too, at some point. I don't remember when I was disabused of that notion. It is baffling. I'm trying to remember the historical reason exactly. I mean, suffice to say, I believe, didn't Washington, D.C.? No. We had people in Washington State first, before we called it D.C. I'm trying to remember the exact timeline. When did the French and Indian War burn it to the ground? Our existing capital. Because that was before we District of Columbia-fied it. It's been a minute. I'd have to double check the time frame on that. I can't remember. No, so it's right around Maryland. So it is the exact opposite coast and south several hundred miles. It is strange. It is an understandably strange thing to be confused and baffled by. I do not begrudge anyone who has been confused by this. It is silly. Of course, then you have a state like Maine, which rather infamously has a number of towns named after rest of the world major cities. In fact, there's this delightful road sign you can find that is pointing off in a bunch of different directions. You've got Paris, you've got Rome, you've got I want to say there's a Spain. There isn't a Madrid. There's a Moscow, Maine. I've been to most of these places too, which is the fun thing. This is going to sound like me ragging on Moscow, Maine, but it is unfortunately in a rather significant state of decline. There's a lot of places in Maine that are in a rather significant state of decline. It used to be a pretty big paper industry hub. It used to have a lot of textile mills, paper mills, various manufacturing jobs, and when all of those basically died, the paper industry death has probably been the most severe of all. There are still a couple. There's one up. Actually, is the one in Millinocket still working? I'm not sure. I'd have to check. I used to know all this, but it's just shocking to see how many of them have died over such a short time frame. And it's like, okay, these mills have died, and these employed hundreds of people, and now the towns that they were in, like, in a lot of cases, there's nothing else. There's very little, and there's very little reason to be going through those towns, to stay in those towns for anything, so it's just through traffic that they get. There's still a bunch of logging that occurs. There is still a couple paper mills that are active. I don't remember if Fraser Paper's mill up in Madawaska, which is right on the border with Canada. In fact, a bunch of people who work at that mill, or worked, maybe past tense, worked at that mill, came from Edmundston. Not to be confused with Edmonton, but Edmundston, which was right across the Canadian border. So a bunch of people who worked at the mill came from across the border. You had quite a bit of intermingling there. I think that one is still up and running. There's a couple others throughout, but yeah, it's so a lot of what Maine gets now is tourism industry. That's a big part of its incoming economy every year. Places like Barsham Harbor probably would have converted to that kind of an industry. I mean, Barsham Harbor sounds very much like any number of shoreside towns that I've been through, and been around when I used to live in Maine, in my ute. Boothbay Harbor, Southport, that sort of thing. Like I can very easily envision the exact situation that's going on in this book. It's pretty shocking. But yeah, it's basically Maryland. It's kind of like a divot out of part of Maryland, Washington, D.C., back to the Washington, D.C. thing. It's, yeah. No, it's, there, to anyone who isn't, like, it's very easy to take that for granted, knowing that particular fact, knowing that Washington, D.C. is, like, basically Maryland, Virginia. It's actually, it is more Maryland than Virginia. It's very easy to make that. And what's even more baffling / infuriating is that it politically it basically isn't allowed to have its own real representation for the longest time. That there have been various movements to give it representation in government because it is, you know, an economic hub just because politics happens there, if nothing else. But it's not it's called like it's a different state, but it isn't quite a different state. It's very small. It's like if you took a city, a sizable city, and was like, this is it's like the Papal City, kind of, in its weird way. It's kind of like that, where it's this sort of its own little weird situation. I've been to and through and around DC a couple times. But yeah, no, it's a very understandable confusion to have for someone who is not a native. So I can definitely understand that. I wonder when I learned. I can't remember. I was young, admittedly, when it became clear, but like when I was very, very young, I was like, yeah, obviously it would be in Washington State. That only makes sense. It's Washington, D.C. It turned out that wasn't the case, but I don't remember when I learned that. Anyway, Chapter 23. Dusk had drawn in by the time we reached the house, and once more the chill of autumn was in the air. Anne and Mrs. Walters went about the preparation of supper in silence. After I had put the car in the barn, I foraged round till I had collected all the wood I could find. Then I went into the living room and built a roaring fire. "Swell," said Anne when she came in and saw it. "Now, if we just had some—" "I have," I told her, "in my bag. You bring glasses." What obscure impulse had led me, day before yesterday, to buy a bottle of scotch and put it in my suitcase, I cannot say, but I was never gladder of anything than of the first draught of that whiskey, and the well-water highball we drank in front of the fire. Just the two of us. Mrs. Walters stayed in the kitchen and impatiently refused an invitation to come and join us. Julian had gone upstairs the moment we had got back to the house, and, though Anne knocked on the door of his room, he declined to come down. He told her that he would appear for supper, but that he did not want to be interrupted until then. So we drank alone, and I was sorry to have it so. We did not talk about the afternoon, nor mention the disturbing inconclusiveness of the inquest. We did not even comment on the ways in which Julian and Mrs. Walters had behaved. Instead, we talked about things we had seen and done on our respective travels in Europe, about the foods we'd eaten, and the wines we had drunk. It was pleasant merely to listen to the way she spoke, softly and with humor. From time to time we clinked the rims of our glasses and took another sip. The firelight was comforting in that room of shadows. Anne felt the same relaxation, almost contentment. Once, after a silence, she said, "This is the first time things have felt right, isn't it?" "Yes," I admitted. "And that's funny, because things aren't at all right, really." "We won't talk about them now. Later. But let's have this as long as we can." We stayed there in front of the fire until Mrs. Walters came into the room and informed us tersely that dinner was ready. A minute later we could hear her knocking at Julian's door, but when she came into the kitchen where we were sitting down, she said shortly, "He won't come. He says he has to work. I'll take a tray up to him." For some reason my brain said, "I'll lay a trap for him." I don't know why. I'm already casting aspersions on Mrs. Walters. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Anyway, he won't come. Says he has to work. I'll take a tray up to him. The meal, like all the others in that house, was a quick and silent one, at least until the very end. Then, to my surprise, Mrs. Walters looked at me and said, "What did you think of that farce this afternoon, Professor Sales?" That we were lucky to come out of it comparatively scot-free. Nonsense. And that I still don't see what happened to Mrs. Marcy. You don't? Why, your own explanation is the only possible one. Is it? I said softly. Maybe. But it is so unlikely that I'm not satisfied with it. Don't forget, I looked at that bank where she went into the river. There's no ledge there sharp enough to do what Dr. Peters described in the way of injuries. She leaned forward and looked heavily into my eyes, as if she wanted me to feel an additional weight behind what she was saying. But there are underwater ledges, Professor Sales. It must have been one of those. No, I answered. I don't think so. A body weighs much less in the water. Even the full sweep of that current wouldn't do to a person the things that happened to Mrs. Marcy. Waves, a heavy surf, might, possibly, but not the steady thrust of that river, strong as it is. She drew back, and her voice was lower. You are quite mistaken. You must be. There is no other way it could have happened. You're very positive, I told her. For Julian's sake, at least, I should think you'd be equally positive. Why? I demanded. I'm sure Julian had nothing to do with the whole thing. I'm not, to tell you the honest truth, so sure about you, Mrs. Walters. The moment I had said it, my doubts rushed together, and I knew that in some obscure way I had hit close to home. She stood up, and it seemed to me that she was making a tremendous effort to master herself. Don't you see what you are doing when you make such statements, Professor Sales? Can't you understand that if there is too much doubt about the way that poor woman came to die, the first thing that will happen is that we shall all be investigated? Very likely, I told her. Let the galled jade wince, our withers are unwrung. In other words, I have no objection to being investigated. I looked full at her. Have you? Good God! She flung out at me. Must you go on thinking in this childish, superficial way? Can't you see that any investigation would result in the police coming here, in their going over the house? Have you no imagination whatever? Where do you think they'll look? Everywhere, I suppose. Yes, everywhere, including Julian's laboratory. And then what do you think would happen? The fury of her outburst, the way she flung words at my head as if they were scalding hot, both amused and irritated me. I don't know what would happen, Mrs. Walters. Nothing very serious, I should think. Julian said that no one could understand his apparatus but a few experts anyhow. She shook her head with a sort of wild impatience. He's just a child, Julian is. He cannot imagine how things will look to an ordinary human being. He's right so far as the principles go. I don't even understand those myself. But I tell you that one look in that room of his, and we should all be in a serious predicament, Professor Sales. You haven't been there, so you don't know, but you've got to believe me when I say that. The police would never keep their mouths shut. They would tell what they saw. And that would be the end of our chance to finish the work here. Those horrible people in Barsham Harbour would never leave us alone once they heard. Heard what? I asked sharply. Her whole manner was so wild and excited that I was afraid she was going to have an attack of hysteria. I've mentioned before how this is from 1937, 38, 39. So, there's some dated terminology. The sharpness of my tone apparently brought her to her senses. She made a visible effort to get control of herself. I've said too much, she declared finally in a milder tone. I realize that you can't believe in what Julian is doing. But I do, and it will be the end of everything if that sheriff and his men come poking into this house. Even if you believe Julian is mad and that I'm... well, I can guess what you think of me, and perhaps some of it is true. You might stop to consider that it will kill your friend Julian Blair if his work is destroyed now. So, Professor Sales, the only course for all of us is to tell the same story that we've told already.
One sec. Twitchbots. Twitchbots. Be banished to the nether realm.
Kind of like Vatican City, yes. Yeah. Or Disneyland. Disney World? Kind of this weird fiefdom. It's not like Disney World. I mean, it kind of is, actually. Right down to the animatronics. I mean politicians. I mean animatronics. No. I was right the first time. Bunch of undead automatons. Or are those the lobbyists? Good question. No, the lobbyists are the mascots, right? There's something to this. There's something to this analogy. Anyway, where were we? Right. Is to tell the same story we've told already. It's too late, I told her. After that verdict at the inquest, the sheriff will be bound to investigate the whole thing until he finds out the truth. I looked at her hard and long. My story has been true. Anne's story is also true. If you and Julian have not told the truth, this is the time to come out with it. She gave me a single sidelong look out of her dark eyes and moved toward the door. "What a fool you must think I am," she said, and shut it behind her. Anne stared at me speechlessly. Well, she said. You certainly struck oil. Yes, I picked up a dish towel. Let's clear this mess up. We can talk while we work. Immediately, sire, she answered and began filling the dishpan. I couldn't tell what that was all about. Could you? No, but she told us one thing. If there was anything funny about what happened to Mrs. Marcy, the motive for whatever part Mrs. Walters had in it is plain enough. She wants to protect Julian until he finishes his work. She won't stick at anything to do it. She won't stick at anything to do it either. What do we do now? She asked after a while. Nothing, I said. Nothing until I get a look at that device of Julian's and find out why it would be so fatal to have anyone see it. That won't be so easy, Dick. He keeps the door locked every second except when he's actually going in and out of the room. He must have a key, I said. If we get hold of that, the rest will be easy. Her reply was a noise which, if it wasn't a snicker, was an exact replica of one. Dick, this is too absurd. We're plotting together like a couple of characters in a bee picture. It's all ridiculous somehow. Maybe. It wasn't so funny earlier today. Or last night. Her tone was apologetic. But let's not forget our original plan. What? To do what we can for Uncle Julian. Yes, I said. I'd rather lost sight of that. Well, let's think some more before we decide on anything. You think, she said. You're the brains of the conspiracy. If only there was somebody around I could vamp for you. There is, I told her. Who? Me? Good heavens, she said. I've been working on you all along. Can I just say, real quick, that despite from our modern perspective, a modern, more liberal perspective, that many of the altercations and descriptions and the position of women in the general writing of these two books, despite that, the conversations that he and Anne have are generally pretty great. You think, she said, you're the brains of the conspiracy. If only there were somebody around I could vamp for you. There is, I told her. Who? Me? Good heavens, she said. I've been working on you all along.
Good shit. Sorry, pardon my French.
This is a Christian. I've read books with literally the fuck word every other word. Okay, I think we can say we use some profanity here every now and again. Right. Chapter 24. Oh, never forget absolution. Never forgetty.
Oh boy. He did drugs. He did so many drugs. But then his fucks went away. Where did the fucks go? Area X has eaten the fucks. Oh no!
Chapter 24. That evening was a strangely happy one. For one thing, Anne and I had the living room to ourselves. Mrs. Walters was nowhere to be seen when we came out of the kitchen, nor did she put in an appearance thereafter. Julian was apparently up in his room. From time to time we could hear the sound of steps over our head, and once a thump that suggested his having dropped a tool. But otherwise the house was silent, and we were alone in it. Thinking back on that strange interlude, I believe that Mrs. Walters had decided she could no longer trust herself to talk with us, and that she felt she had said too much already. So she went to her room. I imagine she even went to sleep. She had nerves of iron, that woman. Much as I hated her then, bitterly as I remember her now, I am compelled to admire her. More than once I have caught myself hoping that she is still alive somewhere. I cannot imagine what she would be doing, or how she was able to explain herself if she did make a new start, in another country perhaps, or at least another part of this one. But Anne and I were not thinking too much of her. We were not really thinking much about anything. We sat on the floor in front of the fire and sipped whiskey and water at intervals that were not too long. I know that the strain of the afternoon had begun to tell on both of us. We were thoroughly relaxed, disinclined to anything important, though we both knew, I think, that we were living that evening not in peace, but an armistice. The fire was warm on our faces and the liquor grateful in our stomachs. We smoked. We talked occasionally and lightly. The things we said have no place here because they had nothing whatever to do with the story of the house on Setauket Point. But they were pleasant and full of meaning when we said them. Once, when the firelight fell on Anne's face at a certain angle, I remembered Helen. The recollection, I found, did not hurt. Instead, it was oddly embarrassing. All at once it seemed to me that I had let part of myself live too long in the past. I was not ashamed of having loved Helen, but rather of the fact that it had taken me so long to get over it. A love that is true to living persons and existing realities is steadfast and fine. But I saw then, for the first time, that a love which was fastened upon the dead and true to nothing but a past that was finished is not a good or true emotion. If it went on too long, it could become an incubus, throttling a man from the real life of the present, which is the life that we were fashioned to meet and experience. After a long time, I said something of that to Anne. I knew that it would have to be explained sometime, and that it would be easier now than ever again. She listened to me quietly and said nothing after I had finished. I wanted not to stop then. I wanted to tell her something of what I felt about her, but I found that I could not. In that house I could confess to things that were over and dead. I did not seem able, somehow, to go on and talk of the future, of anything which looked beyond the instant in which we were. The fire had died to coals when we finally left it to go upstairs. This night I did not put my arm around her, as I had the time before when we went up those stairs together. We said good night in the hall, whispering because we did not want to wake Julian if he had gone to sleep, and we said it almost as casually as if we had been strangers. That seems strange to me now, but it was inevitable then. My room was cold and bleak. I undressed as quickly as I could and lay down in the thick dark. It was the proper time, I told myself, to think things over carefully, to sum up the inquest and that amazing scene in the kitchen with Mrs. Walters. But my mind refused to tether itself to any one subject. It ranged over an extraordinary mélange of things. It tossed up at me the picture of Ellen Hoskins, sitting beside the court clerk and taking her own notes, presumably for her brother. She was a shrewd woman, that sheriff's sister, much cleverer, perhaps, than her brother. No wonder he let her assist him. Then there was the recollection of Anne's brown legs swinging against the cut bank, the curious timidity of Julian's face at the inquest. And then there was nothing. I was asleep. When I woke to a room that was still as black as blindness, I thought at first that I had been having a nightmare. My skin was cold with perspiration, and my heart was pounding with that terrible fear which half strangles you with its intensity. And there was a horror in my mind, unformed and unrecognizable, but washing up over my consciousness in great black waves. I wrestled with that fear as Jacob wrestled with the angel. I told myself that I was awake now and that there was no more cause to be afraid. But there was. I heard the sound at first almost subconsciously, as I must have been hearing it in my sleep. It was not loud, but I knew it for what it was, the same sound that the two of us had heard in the meadow at the moment when the storm was over the house. But this time there was no storm. The night outside the window was still. I could see stars in the sky. And yet the noise was present in my ears, and there could no longer be any doubt at all where it came from. It was in this house. At first, that one fact was all I was able to decide about it. The cold, heavy air of my room was threaded with sound which appeared to have no point of origin, and which was as much a vibration I felt through my skin as a resonance in my ears themselves. If you have ever waked in a western night to hear coyotes howling on a ridge, you will know something of the primitive, irrational fear that it induced in my mind, but nothing of its quality. Perhaps the slither of a snake's scales across a stone floor. I thought of those things and others as I lay there listening. I remembered a night I had once passed in an anchored boat. There had been a small leak in her hull, and all night long I had heard the gurgle and bubble of the sea, deep and very cold, coming in through her bottom. It had not been a dangerous leak, and we pumped it out easily in the morning, but the chuckle of the water as it came up from that gulf under our keel and invaded our small floating world had remained in my mind as a symbol of dread. Not that the thing in the air of that old house resembled in any way physical, not that the thing in the air of that old house resembled in any physical way these sounds that I have described. It was rather a sort of cold, humming whisper which seemed, as I lay listening to, increase and increase by such... Oh gosh, there's no comma there. It was rather a sort of cold, humming whisper which seemed, as I lay listening to, Oh, there it is. Okay, I see what's going on. Line break was throwing me. It was rather a sort of cold, humming whisper which seemed, as I lay listening, to increase and increase by such imperceptible degrees that whole minutes must have passed before it was recognizably louder. At the beginning I had to strain my ears to catch it, but after a time it was inescapably easy to hear. Then it stopped abruptly, and there was nothing but an occasional night noise in the timbers of the house. I began to relax. The air was easier to breathe without that undertone in it. When it began once more, it was so low that I was unsure at first whether I was hearing it again or only remembering. After a while, there was no possible doubt, and I lay there, feeling fear collect in me, more and more coldly and insistently, until the tension was almost unendurable. Any kind of action was preferable to this lying in the dark with terror for a bedfellow. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and got up. By the time I had groped for matches in the pocket of my coat and got the candle lit, the noise had stopped. I stood there in the raw air of the room, holding the candle in a hand that shook in spite of all my willpower, and staring stupidly toward the door. How long I waited like that I have no way of reporting. Long enough to be chilled to the core, at any rate. Gradually, I was aware of another kind of noise, a faint rustle which came through the wall behind me. Anne was moving in there, and the thought steadied me. No matter what was happening, it was my job to keep unafraid and calm. She must be as terrified as I, and she would need whatever strength and poise there was in me. I started toward the door. Before I had taken 3 steps, I knew, rather than heard, that the noise had begun for the 3rd time. It was in the air again, as intangible as the first smell of smoke, and more frightening. The boards under my bare feet were like ice, and it took all my resolution to keep walking cautiously toward the door and the thing, whatever it was, that was making that sound. Julian's invention it must be, of course, but I wondered what his invention really was. What abominable sort of thing would make that noise? It was louder when I opened the door into the hall, and, for the first time, I was aware of the general direction from which it came. A hall ran past me to right and left, and the noise was stronger toward the left. As I stood indecisively looking along that dark passage, there was a click on my right. Anne's door was opening cautiously. The yellow shine of her candle came through it, and in a second she was beside me. She could not have been as cold as I, for she'd had sense enough to put on a long red dressing robe and slippers, but she was shivering violently.
"What is it?"
Her whisper was low.
"The thing of Julian's, I suppose. Beat it back to your room, Anne. I'll look into it." "No, I don't want to be alone." "All right," I told her, "but stay behind me."
We went down the hall toward the crescendo of that sound, and as we walked, I noticed a curious thing to which I paid only casual attention at the time. There was a draft along the floor of the hall, a trickling creep of air that froze my ankles and made the hem of Anne's robe flutter. It was a quiet night. I should have thought more about such a draft of air around our feet, about where it was going and what had set it in motion. But I was so deeply preoccupied with the business of forcing myself to approach the source of that rushing, humming whisper of fear that I could think of nothing else. Our candles threw a good deal of light when we started, but by the time we had covered half of the 8 full paces that lay between my door and the one to Julian's workroom, they had begun to flicker and burn blue. My shadow tumbled and darted ahead of me down the hall, cast by the light from Anne's candle. There was something horribly incongruous in the way it alternately shrank and grew on the boards before me. No, I don't think I shall ever forget that short eternity of a walk from my door to Julian's. His door, when we came to it, was tightly closed. To my surprise, there was no knob on it. In fact, nothing at all except a new round brass lock that shone yellow in the light of our candles. The door, I saw, was not like any of the others in the house. They were old Maine pine, paneled in a graceful 2-fold cross. This door was perfectly flat, and when I touched it, I perceived that it was not even made of wood, but of metal. Okay, one sec. Sorry about that. Whatever, we're almost done. It's not a big deal. Where are we? Right. This door was perfectly flat, and when I touched it, I perceived that it was not even made of wood, but of metal. The cold of steel came through the paint to my fingers. The noise was on the other side of that door. There could be no doubt of it. It was louder here than at any other point, and I could discriminate a number of the elements that went to make it up. There was, below everything else, a humming, tonal constant, but besides that, there was a faint roaring sound which I find it hard to describe, but which was something like the noise of a firebox in a furnace that is running full blast. And then, mingling with those two elements, was a third which I could recognize, the hiss of moving air. The draught which had swirled round our feet was strong in front of that door. Air, it seemed to me, was being sucked into the room, forcing its way into it through the crevices where door and jamb met, brushing past Anne and me as if it were impatient to seek the heart of that sound. Sorry, Nicole Berlino, it was a phone call, and I had to deal with very briefly. I'll have to deal with the fallout after this, but it's okay. We're only a few pages away. Where were we? Right. I wondered at that motion of air, of course, but only with a small segment of my attention. The rest was engrossed in listening. In both Anne's mind and mine, I think, the irrational fear which that sibilant, roaring hum evoked was overlaid with another, horrible sort of dread. Suppose that noise should change, should alter, should begin to define itself. As we heard it then, it was a sort of echo of chaos. But if it were to change and become coherent? If, indeed, there should be whispers that were not those of air in motion? The anticipatory dread of voices was so tremendous that for a time I could only stand before that steel door, pressing the fingers of my free hand against it to steady myself. Half-consciously, I began to mutter to myself under my breath, "The dead do not come back. No matter where or what, or if they exist at all, they will not speak through this thing of Julian's. He is mad, and it doesn't matter that he is a genius and that I know it. He is mad, and there is no possibility there will be more than one voice on the other side of this door. Julian's voice, yes, but only his. Never that of Helen or Mrs. Marcy or the old captain who used to lie in this room and look down at the river. They are all gone." The noise continued. It grew louder until it seemed to me that the floor trembled with it. The air that went past us whittled the flames of our candles to blue points. I could not stand it a second longer. With my clenched fist, I beat against the door. "Julian!" I shouted. "Julian, stop, I say! Turn that damn thing off!" My fist made a kind of metal thunder against the door, though I was ashamed of the way my voice trembled when I shouted, I kept on yelling until the noise on the other side of that door stopped. It ceased abruptly, with a roaring crash that was almost like an explosion. It was, on a lesser scale, the clap of thunder that Anne and I had heard in the meadow. The sudden hush that followed that final crash rang in my ears almost as loud as the clamor of the minute before. Anne drew a deep, uneven breath. "Thanks," she said, whether to me or to the silence, I don't know. We stood there together, shivering and weak and wired, and waited. Jesus. Shivering and weak and waited. I was determined to speak to Julian. He would have to leave that monstrous business of his alone, at least for the rest of this night. The kaleidoscope of all that had happened since I came to Barsham Harbor rushed over me. I felt tired, bewildered, afraid, and more than anything else, angry. Two things happened at once. The door before our faces opened at the fraction of an inch, and Mrs. Walters came heavily down the hall at our backs. Julian's voice, hoarse with some emotion which I could not define, came through the crack of the door.
"Get away," he said. "Get back down the hall and I'll talk to you, but get back from this door."
Mrs. Walters was saying in a tone of sneering triumph, "So, Julian, you see I was right." She looked at us with contempt. "Hasn't either of you enough sense to stay where you belong?" she demanded. I put my hands against her shoulders and pushed her backward down the hall. "Later," I said. "We'll have all this out in the morning, but not now." She retreated. From the expression on her face, I think she was surprised that I had dared to touch her. Julian came out of his room before we had time to become further embroiled. He opened the door, I noticed, just enough to slip out, and then drew it shut and locked it before he turned toward us. His face was gray-white in the glow of our candles, burning steadily now that the draft was gone from the hall, and his eyes were rimmed with the black stain of fatigue. He came toward us down the hall as if his strength were almost gone. Apparently he had not yet been to bed. At any rate, he was fully dressed in the suit he had worn to the inquest.
"Never do that again,"
he said, and his voice trembled with wrath.
"Never!"
"See here, Julian," I said in as restrained a tone as I could bring myself to employ. "You simply cannot run that damn thing of yours in the house at night. Neither I nor Anne can bear the noise it makes. You ought to be in bed." He looked at me dully.
"What time is it?"
"I don't know. After midnight."
2 a.m,
Anne's voice contributed. "Trying to do it all yourself, Julian?" Mrs. Walters' tone was harsh and sarcastic, but her face was strained and there was pleading in it. Julian made a motion toward me.
"All right, Dick. No more tonight, I promise. In the morning, I want to have a talk with you."
He sounded merely tired. There was no more anger in his voice. "Good," I told him. "Only get some sleep first. There's no need to work yourself to death, you know. You mustn't drive yourself so hard." He shook his head.
"I'm not so sure, my boy. Not after today. And yesterday," he added as an afterthought.
Mrs. Walters was still staring at him. 3 years, Julian. 3 years. And you lock me out at the end." His voice was dull. Everything but fatigue and despair was gone out of it.
"You know why that is, Esther. I cannot trust you any more."
With that, he turned on his heel and opened a door across from the steel one which gave onto his workroom.
"Good night," he said heavily. "Anne, my dear, I am sorry that you were frightened. It's all right now."
The three of us looked at each other after he went. Mrs. Walters was haggard, her face mottled by frustration and unhappiness. I felt an uncomprehending pity for her. "Well," I said with an unpleasant, false brightness, "we may as well get some sleep now." Anne's shoulders shook, and suddenly she was crying and clinging to me. Over her shoulder, I said to Mrs. Walters, "All right, I'll take care of her." She looked at us for a slow minute, almost as if she doubted our existence, turned, and went back to her room. We were left standing together in the hall, and I forgot about everything else while I used my arms and hands and lips to exorcise Anne's tears. I put our candles on the floor, and after that, it was easier. And that is where we will call it for today. I'm not quite sure if they are meant to be having romantic altercations there. I don't think he calls it out in the subsequent chapter. But anyway, they've had a traumatic experience. Several traumatic experiences, actually, considering they witnessed a badly injured, if not dead, person, and then are being interrogated by the police and a small town which is incredibly hostile towards them. Oh wow, it is snowing quite a bit. Note to self, I'm going to have to move my car. But yeah, so we're getting to the climax of the book. Next week, it all comes together. One of the things that I do really respect about William Sloane in these two books, collected in the Rim of Morning collection, is his sense of pacing. For a good stretch, it's kind of like, okay, what's going on? But he knows exactly when to be like, I'm going to crank up the foreboding a minute so that you know there's a bunch of premonition shit occurring. This is like, oh yeah, we're going to allude to something that's going to happen. He's very good at being like, oh, okay, I can be patient. Let's see where this goes. So he's pretty good about that. I think maybe his pacing is a little better in the first one, To Walk the Night. A bit more evenly paced, whereas this one, a lot happens very quickly in the end. But at the same time, I feel like the narrative and the characters in this one stand out to me a bit more. But yeah, so next week, we might even find out what exactly Julian's machine is. So, good times. Next week will actually be happening. I was concerned that it wouldn't. It's looking like the week after, though, is going to be a complete wash. So, I won't know for sure, but so far, next week we should be wrapping up basically everything that we've got going currently, just in time for everything to be a complete mess, and my schedule is going to get very slipshod and unreliable, and I will not be able to tell you just yet what that's going to look like. I will get it figured out. Suffice it to say, I will continue streaming, but there is going to be at least a week where things are going to be a little wild. And that isn't, unfortunately, due to family or vacation obligations. Much as I wish it were. Oh God, how I wish. Oh, I wish. But instead, other work-related obligations that I have burdened myself with. Never let yourself get volunteered for things, is what I'm saying. So, the basic game plan is we get through this week and next week, at which time we'll have wrapped up basically everything we've got queued up. This Friday we should be getting through all of the Nightland, the rest of the Nightland. And then next week we'll do, I guess, the short stories, the few short stories that are at the back of this, that's right, drop whatever that was, this Volume 4 of the collected fiction of William Hope Hodgson, Volume 4, because why not? Some of them are charming, some of them are fun, some of them are like, I'm not sure why this is here. But we will get through them. And then after that, everything is up for grabs. I will prioritize doing Endymion by Dan Simmons first. What it probably is going to happen is that I will have a much more limited streaming schedule for a while. I don't know how long. At least a month, maybe longer. And so what I'll do is it'll be like, all the streams that I have will be dedicated solely to reading Endymion, as opposed to doing 3 different books every week. I'm kind of amazed that I've been able to do it for the last 2-3 years. I'm kind of pleased that I've been able to do it for the past 2-3 years. We can eventually get back to that, I believe, but the days will change. When I know more about what my schedule is going to look like, I will make it clear on the Discord, because that is the best thing I can do for now. And I'll try and change the channel, or the YouTube channel header and Twitch channel header, so that whatever changes, if they become permanent, or even lengthy temporary, midterm temporary, will be reflected there. I have not updated the playlists. I will do that at the end of next week. That is what will happen, because by then we will have read through everything. If for some reason we have, I don't know, like a gap day where where I've already read through or finished a book at that point. I don't think there will be, but if there is, hypothetically, I'll just find some random short stories to read. It'll still be on. You'll still get something. Actually, because it'll be close to being seasonal, I might find some seasonal ones, but I'm not going to promise that just yet. Anyway, that's it for today. We will be back this Friday with the thrilling conclusion of The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson, so we have that to look forward to. Thank you to everyone who introduced me to him. I appreciate you. I am very glad to have him enriching my life. It has been a blast. Thank you to everyone who has heckled me to read segments of that book in different voices. You're keeping me from going crazy. Actually acts as a very interesting concentration aid focus for some of the brutal prose, and it makes it most people I think listening to it are going to be kind of baffled by it, but at the same time, it's being done to have fun, not to mock, but to have fun and enjoy ourselves. It isn't a very clean recording as a result, but none of these are clean recordings, so it is what it is. Anyway, yeah, I will see you all Friday. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. There are a bunch of you. It's not telling me names of everyone. What is it doing? It broke! Don't break! Come on! Yeah, like 6 people tuning in on YouTube. That's gotta be a fluke of the algorithm. Anyway, until next time, toodaloo! Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. Stay toasty, or cool, depending on where you are. If you're in Australia, stay cool. Holy spinoli. If you're not in Australia, say you're in, I don't know, the east, somewhere on the eastern seaboard of the United States, we're getting, things are exciting right now. What is it, La Nina, I believe? I believe it's a La Nina. Was it an El Nino? I can't remember. Anyway, it's actually cold for the first time in like 5 years. So, there is that. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you all later.